They said he was the Prince of Darkness. But at his funeral, as thousands mourned, his eldest son Louis Osbourne stepped forward with words no one expected. Not just grief, but betrayal, secrets, and a final confession that rewrote the legacy of Ozzy Osbourne. The church bells of Birmingham tolled heavy that morning. Rain trickled down stained glass windows as if the heavens themselves were weeping. Ozzy Osbourne, the man who once seemed immortal, was gone. Fans lined the streets in silence, clutching vinyl records, posters, and crosses. Some sang softly, their voices trembling, but inside the church, the atmosphere was fractured. Empty seats stared back at the family, seats that had been reserved for rock legends, brothers in arms, lifelong friends, seats that should have been filled with faces who once swore loyalty to Ozzy. They weren't there. And in that moment, Louis Osbourne, the son most had forgotten, rose to the podium. His voice cracked, not just with grief, but with fury. You called him your brother. You said you owed him everything. But today, when it mattered most, you weren't here. The silence in the room grew suffocating. This was not the polished farewell anyone expected. It was raw, it was bitter, and it was the beginning of a reckoning that would shatter the myth of Ozzy's perfect rock brotherhood and reveal the truth of a father and son long divided. To the world, Ozzy Osbourne was the untouchable Prince of Darkness, the voice of Black Sabbath, a man who defied death itself. But behind the screaming crowds and flashing lights, his life was a battlefield of chaos, alcohol, drugs, fights, endless tour. For decades, these were the foundations of Ozzy's existence. And while fans worshipped his madness, one boy watched from the shadows, his eldest son, Louis. Louis grew up with silence where a father's voice should be. Birthdays came and went without a phone call. Christmas meant a card scribbled in haste from a hotel in Tokyo, or nothing at all. His mother, Thelma Riley, tried to keep the family together, but every time Ozzy returned from the road, it ended the same way: shouting, slammed doors, and another night spent in the pub. When Sharon entered Ozzy's life, the fracture became permanent. A new wife, a new family, a new reality TV dynasty. Louis was erased, cut out of the story, left on the sidelines as strangers filled the role of family on MTV's The Osbournes. By 15, Louis had stopped waiting. He drowned his anger in raves, drugs, and late nights, saying, "If my father screamed into the world to be seen, I just wanted to forget being invisible." The Osbourne name brought him no comfort, only a shadow he couldn't escape. But Louis wasn't just a ghost of Ozzy's past. He built a life of his own. In the underground clubs of London and Berlin, he found music again, not the heavy metal roar of his father, but the hypnotic pulse of house and techno. Behind the turntables, Louis was free, not Ozzy's son, not forgotten, just an artist with his own rhythm he found love to. Louise, an Irish actress and writer, gave him what fame never could: peace. Together, they raised their children far from the spotlight, in Ireland's quiet landscapes. To friends, Louis was not the son of a legend. He was a husband, a father, a man who carved dignity out of silence. Yet, deep inside, the wound remained. For years, he wrote letters Ozzy never read. He left voicemails that went unanswered. He watched his siblings Jack, Kelly, Amy live under Ozzy's roof while he stood on the outside. But fate has a cruel way of circling back. In Ozzy's final years, as illness stole his body and tour became impossible, Louis reappeared. Not with anger, not with demands, but with a quiet presence. He sat at his father's bedside, held his hand, and whispered words he once thought he'd never say: "I forgive you." It was July 5, 2025. Villa Park Stadium, Birmingham. Black Sabbath's final show. The lights dimmed, the crowd roared, and Ozzy, fragile, trembling, but unbroken, screamed the opening lines of Children of the Grave. For the audience, it was history. For Louis, it was destiny. He sat in the shadows, eyes wet, hands shaking. When the last note rang out, the cameras caught him, a son, breaking before the world. And then, he walked onto the stage. No script, no spotlight, just raw truth. "I cried tonight," he confessed. Not just for pride, not just for fear, but because I finally understood. Music was how my father loved me. The crowd fell silent. Ozzy, slumped in a chair, nodded slowly, a gesture small, but heavier than words. Father and son, divided for decades, united at last under the roar of 30,000 voices. Weeks later, in a quiet room filled with lavender and fading sunlight, Louis sat at his father's side one last time. Ozzy whispered with what little breath he had left, "I miss being your dad. I'm sorry." And Louis answered softly, "That's enough." 2 days later, Ozzy was gone. Ozzy's funeral was not just a farewell. It was a mirror, a reflection of loyalty and absence, a reminder of who stood by him and who didn't. Fans cried in the rain, chanting his name like a hymn. Louis stood tall, clutching a silver cross brooch Ozzy had given him as a boy. He was no longer the forgotten son. He was the voice of the family. The whispered whispers. Most of Ozzy's fortune went to Sharon and the children who lived under his roof. But Louis didn't flinch. "I don't feel cheated," he said. "My father gave me something greater than money. He gave me forgiveness. And that is where the legend of Ozzy Osbourne truly lives, not only in platinum records and chaotic headlines, but in the brokenness that made him human, and in the silence that finally spoke louder than the music." Legends don't die, Louis said. They move from the stage to eternity. For every fan who ever screamed his lyrics, for every son who ever waited for a father's love. The story of Ozzy and Louis is proof. Forgiveness is the loudest song of all. The funeral was over. The bells had stopped. The rain had thinned into a soft drizzle, almost like the world itself exhaling. But for Louis Osbourne, the real storm had only just begun when Ozzy's coffin was lowered into the ground. Thousands of fans pressed against the barriers outside, chanting his name in unison. "Ozzy, Ozzy, Ozzy." Their voices rolled like thunder through the streets of Birmingham. Some were old men who had followed Black Sabbath since 1970. Others were teenagers who had never seen Ozzy live, but wore shirts with his face, as if he had raised them to dot. Yet inside the family circle, the air was not only heavy with grief, it was tense with silence. People whispered about the will, about inheritance, about who had been left with what. And then, like a sudden spark in the dark, came Louis Osbourne's words. Reports surfaced that most of Ozzy's estate, his music rights, royalties, properties, and investments were left to Sharon and the 3 children she had raised with him: Jack, Kelly, and Amy. The rest, a smaller fraction, went to Louis and his sister Jessica. To some, it seemed unfair. To others, it was expected. Sharon had been Ozzy's partner in chaos and survival for more than 4 decades. She wasn't just his wife, she was his manager, his protector, his anchor when the drugs nearly killed him, when the scandals nearly ended him. But for Louis, who had lived decades apart from his father, the division of assets wasn't what mattered. He broke his silence online, writing, "I don't feel cheated. I don't feel forgotten. Because in those last days, my father gave me something more valuable than any fortune. He gave me his truth. He gave me his apology. He gave me forgiveness. And that's worth more than gold." The post went viral. Fans debated fiercely. Some praised his grace. Others accused the family of cutting him out. But in the noise of arguments, one thing rang clear. Louis was no longer silent. For the first time in his life, he had spoken not as Ozzy's shadow, but as Ozzy's son. Sharon Osbourne stood stoic during the funeral, her black veil covering her face, her hand gripping the casket until the very last second. People criticized her. People defended her. Some said she controlled Ozzy to the very end, deciding who was allowed close and who wasn't. Others reminded the world that without Sharon, Ozzy might have been dead decades earlier. Louis himself addressed this in his post. "People talk about Sharon as if she was my enemy. But I know the truth. She stood by my father when no one else did. She caught him when he fell. She pulled him out of the abyss over and over again. If anyone deserves the largest part of his legacy, it's her." This shocked many who expected bitterness. Instead, Louis showed respect. It was a moment of maturity, a gesture that even critics couldn't ignore. At the funeral, Louis wasn't the forgotten boy anymore. He wasn't the outsider who had spent years watching his father on television, erased from the story. That day, he stood tall. When he walked behind the coffin, his coat buttoned high, his hand resting on a silver cross brooch Ozzy had once given him. It wasn't for cameras. It wasn't for headlines. It was for himself. He had finally stepped into the light, not the spotlight of fame, but the light of closure. One fan, standing in the rain, recalled, "When I saw Louis there, walking behind the coffin, I thought, this is what forgiveness looks like. This is what strength looks like." For decades, Louis had been defined by absence, but now, he was defined by presence, by the courage to forgive. What made Ozzy's funeral different from others was the scale of grief. In Brazil, fans held candlelight vigils on the beaches of Rio, blasting Crazy Train through portable speakers. In Japan, people left flowers outside record stores, bowing in silence before his albums. In Los Angeles, murals of Ozzy's face appeared overnight, spray-painted tributes with the words, "Legends never die." One video went viral. A group of young musicians in Birmingham gathered outside the church during the funeral. They played "See You on the Other Side" on acoustic guitars, their voices trembling, their eyes red. As Louis exited the church, he paused, listening. He didn't speak. He simply placed a hand on his chest, then bowed his head before them. That small gesture was replayed millions of times online. For fans, it wasn't just a bow. It was a bridge from father to son, from icon to ordinary people, from pain to healing. Ozzy Osbourne left behind more than music, more than platinum records and sold-out stadiums. He left behind contradictions. The man who bit the head off a bat, yet whispered apologies to his son in his final breath. The man who screamed into microphones about hell and chaos, yet found peace in a lavender-filled room before dying quietly in his sleep. Louis said it best in his tribute, "My father's legacy, it in awards or wealth. It lives in every broken soul who found strength in his music, in every lonely kid who listened to Paranoid at midnight and felt less alone, in every mother who found comfort in Mama, I'm coming home." That's where he lives now. That's where he'll always live. And maybe that's why his death didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation, a passing of the torch not only to his children, but to the millions who carried his voice inside them. Weeks after the funeral, Louis gave one final interview. No cameras, no stage lights, just a quiet room, a single chair, and a microphone. The interviewer asked him, "Do you think you and your father ever truly reconciled?" Louis paused for a long time. His eyes filled, but he didn't look away. Then he said, "We didn't need years to reconcile. We didn't need long conversations. We just needed one moment, one look, one apology. That was enough. My father died, but I didn't lose him. I finally found him." Silence hung in the room, the kind of silence that carries more weight than words. The story of Ozzy and Louis Osbourne isn't just about rock and roll. It isn't just about fame or fortune. It's about something every person understands, the longing for a parent's love. We all carry wounds. We all carry silence. And sometimes, forgiveness feels impossible. But in Ozzy's final days, father and son found a way back to each other. And that lesson, more than any album, more than any award, is the one that will echo forever. Louis himself said it best. "Forgiveness is the loudest song my father ever gave me." Imagine it now. A dark stage, a single spotlight. An empty microphone standing in silence. And in the distance, faintly, the sound of thousands chanting, "Ozzy, Ozzy, Ozzy." The man may be gone, the music may fade, but the echo remains. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, did not leave quietly. He left with a roar, a confession, and a son who finally found his voice. And as Louis walked away from that funeral, coat heavy with rain, cross shining against his chest, he was no longer just Ozzy's forgotten child. He was proof that love can survive absence, that forgiveness can rise from pain, that legends never die.